Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, I am going to profile one of my favorite decks of all time. Technically, it was the first deck that I ever used to top 8 a regional, which was obviously a very important moment in my Yu-Gi-Oh! Career. I'll talk a little bit more about that particular deck in a later video, because it occurred after the emergency ban list that occurred during the beginning of the summer 2008 format. The emergency ban list addressed the problems created by the Dark Arm Dragon return deck that I'm going to profile today. I have elected to profile Jerry Wang's winning deck from the Shonen Jump in Columbus, Ohio in March of 2008. Technically, Dark Arm Dragon return decks popped up in February of 2008 at Shonen Jump Houston. It didn't actually win that first event. Six Samurai won the first event that Dark Arm Dragon was legal. Then we saw it move on to Costa Mesa, eventually dominate Costa Mesa, and then dominate all the way up to the emergency banning of Dimension Fusion, the emergency limitation of return from the different dimension, and the emergency semi-limitation of Allure of Darkness. Comboed with the release of Gladiator Beast during the summer of 2008, Dark Arm Dragon Return itself actually had a fairly short-lived window in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. We're talking about a deck that was only really at its peak for a few months, but during those few months, it was by far the most dominant deck. Virtually everybody in an event that could afford Dark Arm Dragon, which was not exactly the easiest thing in the world at its $300+ price tag, was running Dark Arm Dragon return decks. Not to mention, this was the part in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Crush Card Virus was reprinted for the very first time as another pretty expensive Gold Series card. At the beginning of the format, technically it was still a prize card, so I'm talking about Costa Mesa, I'm talking about Houston, those early events. It wasn't until the middle stages of what was still a relatively short format where Crush Card Virus was quote-unquote easily accessible at a short price tag of $200 to $300, making this easily one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most expensive decks of all time. And unfortunately for a lot of the players at the time, there wasn't a lot of alternatives. If you didn't want to fork out $50 a piece for Allure of Darkness, if not more, $300 a piece for 3 Dark Arms, something like $80 for a copy of Dark Lord Zerato, the $300 for a Crush Card Virus, your options were pretty limited. You had Six Samurais, which technically won the Shonen Jump in Houston, but not a deck that I thought was particularly great. You had some OTK or FTK variants that utilized Cyber Valley, Defusion, Spell Economics, and then either Shadow Priestess of Ohm or Tuned Cannon Soldier. Those decks weren't overwhelmingly expensive. You could have run DDT. What that would have allowed you to do is not buy a Crush Card Virus. It also allowed you to cut back on your Dark Arm Dragons. Some of those DDT variants only ran 2 Dark Arm Dragons, so it saves you a few $100s there, but you do need to go get a Magical Stone Excavation, which was still really expensive. So anyway, you cut it, unless you wanted to play off-the-grid road decks, which did not do well at any event where Dark Arm Dragon was legal. You didn't have a lot of options. Other than, I guess, technically Gladiator Beasts. I should put a note there that Gladiator Beast, as you might typically think, the one with Geyseris and Cold Wave, didn't come out until, of course, Geyseris was released in the same set as the Lightsworn engine. But Paul Leviton did win a Shonen Jump with a Gladiator Beast variant based on Shadow Imprisoning Mirror and Gladiator Beast Heraklinos. So there was technically another quote-unquote budget deck that was somewhat difficult to play and obviously not very popular, or else it would have topped a bunch during that format. But again, other than that, Dark Arm Dragon Return, not much in between. I actually really like this format. A lot of people look at this format and think it's an OTK-based format. It's a really bad format. Dark Arm Dragon here, Dark Arm Dragon there. Yeah, technically, you could get OTK'd on the first turn with Dark Arm Dragon and with very little resistance. Obviously, that's a possibility. I really like this format because one of the biggest elements of this format is maximizing your draw power and sequencing it effectively so that you can reach those power trap cards like Drop Dust Shoot, Mind Crush, and Crush Card, but also maximize the use of Return from the Different Dimension, Cyber Valley, and Dimension Fusion. The amount of combos that you can do where you're Cyber Valley and cards on the top of your deck, banishing stuff in hand, flipping Return from the Different Dimension, bringing back a Stratos, shuffling your deck because the only card to put back on top with something dead like Machine Duplication, getting a fresh card, banishing this. I mean, the plays were endless, and the ability to work through some of those really elongated plays really make this a format that I enjoy going back and playing. It's also one of those formats that was really short-lived, and I think even though it was short-lived, people really refined it quite well by the end. At the beginning, the Dark Arm Dragon return decks typically ran cards like Mystic Tomato and Armageddon Knight, Prometheus, Strike Ninja, maybe even DD Scout Plane of all things. Give it a month, Jerry Wang, and then I think even going forward, really refined what Dark Arm Dragon deck should look like. The Dark Arm Dragon deck that we're going to profile today is going to emphasize 3 copies of Cyber Valley with a machine duplication. I think Cyber Valley, and I'll mention this in a little bit in the deck profile, was one of the most underrated cards in Phantom Darkness, the set that really opened the doors to this particular deck as a whole. And as a result, it took a little while for people to realize that Cyber Valley was more than just an FTK tool. When people first looked at it, they thought, okay, comboing this with spell economics, defusion, drawing my whole deck, finding a way to FTK with Toon Table of Contents and the Toon Cannon Soldier or Shadow Priestess of Ohm or Mass Driver, and I'm just going to FTK. Well, the reality of the situation was Cyber Valley was probably best in actual Dark Arm Dragon return decks, and it took people a little while to realize that. But nevertheless, this is Jerry Wang's first place deck from the Shonen Jump Championship in Columbus, 2008. All right, we'll start the deck profile with the deck's namesake, which is 3 copies of Dark Arm Dragon. Unfortunately, you really needed 3 copies in order to be competitive back at the beginning of 2008. You could try to afford different cards. Dark Nephthys may have been a replacement. Technically, somebody did top a YCS or a Shonen Jump with Dark Nephthys instead, but really to be competitive, you needed the full 3 copies of Dark Arm Dragon unless you wanted to play some of the OTK decks I'll talk about in a little bit. But we'll start with the deck's namesake, Dark Arm Dragon. Next, we'll talk about the Destiny Hero package. The first time Dark Arm Dragon debuted at a Shonen Jump Championship, it did really well. It didn't actually win. 6 Samurais of all things won. But when people first started building this deck, they had cards like Armageddon Knight, Mystic Tomato, and Prometheus, Strike Ninja, even DD's Scout Plane. Those cards over time lost popularity, and the Destiny Hero package basically became the standard after a few months. The Destiny Hero package at the time involved 2 copies of Destiny Hero Malicious. It was semi-limited to 2. Jerry Wang then elected to run 1 Plasma, 1 Disc Commander, and 1 Dasher. Disc Commander, even without the full Destiny Hero package, was really good because Monster Reborn was recently unbanned, so it was an incredible power card there. Plasma was really good and particularly important because if you could suck up a Stratos or higher, the attack of a Stratos onto a Plasma, the 900 onto the 2900 of the Plasma, made it so the Plasma reached 2800 itself. That was really challenging because the best thing your opponent could really do then is crash a Dark Arm Dragon. If you have a Stratos on a Plasma, they can't use Dark Arm Dragon's effect, of course, because of Plasma, so the best thing that they can do is crash. And if you could get anything with more attack position, or attack power than a Stratos, you were able to essentially lock your opponent out of any effects, which was really good. This deck didn't have Dark Hole. This deck, generally speaking, by this point, didn't really main deck copies of cards like Regeki Break, so it was actually really hard to deal with the Plasma. Dasher was an interesting choice. Dasher, there were some big attack monsters that I'm going to profile next that were really good targets. Even if you hit a card like Cyber Valley too, it wasn't that bad. It saved you a normal summon. And then, of course, the single copy of Stratos. Next, we'll talk about the big monsters. These are monsters that you really want to either tutor out with Gold Sark, I'll talk about that in a little bit, or return from the different dimension in Defusion. Jinzo was really important because when you played a card like Return from the Different Dimension, as was popular in this build, or even Escape from the Dark Dimension, which was another card that was somewhat popular at the time, bringing back Jinzo essentially acted as a pseudo trap stun. It made it so that Return from the Different Dimension was somewhat defensive on your opponent's turn. Your opponent may have been banking on their return winning the game, and then you could flip your return, bring out your Jinzo, and at least for a turn stall out. Dark Magician of Chaos is an obvious inclusion. This deck's running Allure, this deck's running Return, this deck's running Defusion. Dark Magician of Chaos is an obvious inclusion. I'll talk more about some of the combos with this card in a little bit. And then Zerato might be a little bit of an interesting choice. One of the main reasons why people elected to run Dark Lord Zerato is if you activated the one-of power card Dimension Fusion, which was emergency banned pretty soon after this event, if you were to activate this, both players would bring back their entire banished piles, and if you were playing in the mirror match, typically both players would have a pretty loaded banished pile, from Allures to Destiny Hero Malicious using its natural effect, maybe even Dark Arm Dragon. As a result, if you defusioned and couldn't attack over all their monsters and then attack directly, you might not actually be able to win. Not saying this card wouldn't be good, but if you brought back something like your opponent's Stratos or Dark Magician of Chaos, if you're not winning that turn, you might not actually end up winning the game in general. What Dark Lord Zerato allowed you to do is it allowed you to bring it out off a defusion, discard a dark from your hand, and then destroy all of your opponent's monsters. You very rarely actually tribute summon this using its effect, the reduced tribute cost when you have 4 dark monsters. You virtually always brought it out of their banished pile with either defusion or return. So that was why this card was included. It allowed you to clear your opponent's board without necessarily always having Dark Arm Dragon. So it was a really powerful card to bring back out of the banished pile. We'll talk more about defusion and some of those piles in a little bit. Next is Cyber Valley. This was once first printed I think one of the most underappreciated and underrated cards from Phantom Darkness. So many of the cards in this deck came from Phantom Darkness, so many at least of the power cards. Cyber Valley, I think, took a back seat at the very beginning because most people thought this was exclusively an FTK or an OTK card. I'll talk a little bit about the FTKs involving this when I finish the entire deck profile. I think Jerry Wang really showed that this card had a spot in actual Dark Arm return. The amount of plays that this card enables is virtually endless. And I can't even begin to tell you how many times you'll just normal summon this on turn 1, maybe having used something like a Destiny Draw or a Lure of Darkness, and just on turn 1 banish the Cyber Valley on your board, and then a card like Dark Magician of Chaos from your hand to stack your draw card back on top, and then set a card like Return. If your opponent can't beat you right there, that return from the different dimension on the following turn is going to bring these both back, allow you to return a spell from your graveyard to your hand, allow you to draw 2 cards. It allowed you to do so many things that essentially turned your return from the different dimensions into virtual Pot of Greeds. Like, there were many times where you're trying to set up, you can't quite OTK, but you have a Cyber Valley and let's say a Sangan banished, and you just return just to draw 2 again, because then you can banish the Valley and the Sangan to draw 2. All 3 of these cards' effects mattered. Stopping battle mattered a lot. You could sometimes return from the different dimension during your opponent's battle phase. Let's say they tried to OTK you without Dark Arm, so they let you keep your back rows. There's Errata, maybe already popped your other monsters, and it acts as a pseudo threatening roar. It allows you to banish 2, of course, to draw. That's incredibly powerful when sometimes you go a very common sequence. Destiny Draw, Malicious, banish, bring it out, draw 2, turn 1. You're up to 7 cards on the first turn, and you're already fueling your banished pile. It really did everything that you wanted with this deck, and it comboed incredibly, of course, with Machine Duplication. I'll talk a little bit more about Cyber Valley and some of the combos once I finish the deck profile, but I cannot stress enough, when Phantom Darkness first came out, people were obsessed about Dark Arm Dragon and all of the awesome secret rares and other cards. This card, I think, was one of the most underrated cards out of that entire set. So next we have just some of the utility monsters. We have a single copy of Sangan, a single copy of Card Trooper, a single Dark Grepher, and a Spirit Reaper. And I'll just array the other monsters out so you can see these while we talk about the last few. So with these utility monsters, if I went back and played this format, I would not run Card Trooper. I don't think using your normal summon on Card Trooper is almost ever a good decision. I know it can fuel monsters in the graveyard for Dark Arm Dragon, but I don't think it's worthwhile. Nevertheless, Jerry Wang ran it, so we're going to include it in our deck profile. So that's our Card Trooper. Sangan is an obvious inclusion. It can search all the Destiny heroes that you'd want to search, the lower attack ones, of course. It could search the Cyber Valley. You're also running Crush Card Virus, so anytime you can combo Sangan and Crush, it's obviously a great combo. Next, single copy of Spirit Reaper. If your opponent cannot Dark Arm Dragon or Zerata you, Spirit Reaper was actually a little bit annoying to deal with. In terms of natural outs, you only really had Brain Control, so you really could, unless you wanted to play a card like Torrential, you really could stall out a little bit with Reaper. It also was a format where virtually nobody ran traditional defense cards other than Torrential, so you could pretty reliably attack with Spirit Reaper and get in some incremental card advantage that way. Honestly, if I went back in time, I'd also cut Spirit Reaper. I'd rather cut both of these cards and play something like Upstart Goblin, quite frankly. I think these normal summons are not worthwhile. But nevertheless, being authentic to the time period, we have both Card Trooper and Spirit Reaper. And then arguably one of the most important utility cards is Dark Grepher. It became pretty apparent very quick for a lot of players that Armageddonite was inferior to Dark Grepher. Towards the beginning of Dark Arm Dragon's release, a lot of players ran the Armageddonite instead. It became really clear that Dark Grepher, the ability to special summon it, the ability to ditch 2 darks right away, and quite frankly, the fact that it itself represents 3 darks. You know, you ditch a dark, use Dark Grepher, you ditch a Malicious, you send a Dasher or a Disc Commander. That's already 3 darks right there. So just with one monster, you're able to fuel 3 darks in the graveyard and then summon Dark Arm Dragon on the next turn. So Dark Grepher, huge combo piece. The ability to special summon was massive. There are obviously some pretty big monsters in the deck, level 6s and level 8s. So there were situations where you could go special summon, ditch Malicious, summon the Malicious from your deck, tribute because you haven't used your normal summon Dark Magician at Chaos, bring back a power spell, and then win the game because of it. And then also fuel a bunch of darks in the grave at the same time. So Dark Grepher filled a lot of very important roles in this deck. So that is the monster lineup. Moving on to the spell lineup. We have 3 of the brand new Allure of Darkness, another awesome card from Phantom Darkness, probably the card that has the longest staying power. This was most recently competitive in the Orcus deck. Sometimes you see Dark Arm Dragon, but honestly, it's kind of fallen out of favor. Some of the other cards in Phantom Darkness have the many years of Yu-Gi-Oh's history been popular, but I think Allure of Darkness is one of the cards. We've seen it in Black Wings, we've seen it in Orcust, we've seen it in this deck. Maybe even versions of Twilight played it. That has really had the longest staying power. But we had 3 copies of Allure. We also had 3 copies of Destiny Draw. The 3 Destiny Draw with the 3 Allure of Darkness, I think, is what really made this deck powerful. The ability to siphon through your deck looking for power cards, particularly power trap cards I'm going to talk about in a little bit, I think was critical. And I think once people realized the Destiny Draw engine was better than the Mystic Tomato, Prometheus, Strike Ninja nonsense, this deck was really virtually unbeatable. From that point on, we have a bunch of power 1-ofs. We have a single copy of Heavy Storm. This card was one of the most misplayed cards in the format. I pretty much activate this card anytime I draw it in the mirror match if my opponent has back rows, because it plays around Return from the Different Dimension. Return is so powerful that just destroying it even 1-for-1ing, even if you have no follow-up play, no intention of OTKing, is worthwhile. You don't want to allow your opponent to reach their draw phase with a set live return. If that's going to happen, then you're probably going to lose, because if they're running this variant with Cyber Valleys, they're probably going to be able to generate so much card advantage. So just 1-for-1 the Heavy Storm. At that point on, we have a single copy of Reinforcements of the Army to search out some of our power cards, like Stratos and Dark Grepher. We have single copy of Brain Control. In this deck, obviously, there's not a lot of tribute monsters, but there is Cyber Valley. So the ability to Cyber Valley and Brain Control, obviously really good. You get to draw 2 cards, clear your opponent's monster. We have 1 copy of Machine Duplication to combo with our Valleys. We have a single copy of Scapegoat. Scapegoat is really good because depending on the situation, you can survive some OTK pushes with it. You also can activate it during the end phase, summon Cyber Valley, banish 1 of the tokens to draw 2. You also contribute them off for Plasma. Again, summoning Plasma is really powerful in this deck. Even just having Plasma versus an opponent's Stratos, like I mentioned, is really hard for your opponent to deal with. So Scapegoats had a lot of utility. We have 1 Premature and 1 Monster Reborn. Interesting tidbit of information. Back in this beginning of this format, they actually unbanned Monster Reborn of all cards and banned Call of the Hunted. I think their logic was, if we're going to allow people to play with Dark Magician of Chaos and Disc Commander, we need to make it so that there's an out to it. Instead of just banning all of this powerful recursion, their thought was, let's punish you for putting Disc Commander in the graveyard by allowing your opponent to Monster Reborn your Disc Commander. Really flawed logic if you ask me, but nevertheless, we have 2 power spell recursion cards. I'll talk a little bit about the interaction with those in a moment. We had Defusion, which was emergency banned in the middle of this format. I'll talk a little bit about the emergency bans once I'm done with the ban list, with the entire list of this deck. But 1 Defusion, most powerful card in the deck. This is a little bit of a debatable one. So when I play this format, I allow both players to use Gold Sark. It was a prize card at the time and a very expensive card. I like Gold Sark because, unlike Crush Card Virus, it's actually quite skill intensive. If I open Gold Sark in a really slow hand with no Defusion and no return, I'll typically activate it and search either Defusion or Reborn, or sometimes Rhoda if my hand is really that bad. These are the 3 cards I typically search on turn 1. Otherwise, if I have any of these 4 cards, I actually keep it in my hand and then use it as a tutor for whatever monster in my deck I need. So, for example, if I could set return and keep Gold Sark in my hand, on the following turn I can Gold Sark for any monster in the deck, from Stratos, Dark Magician of Chaos, Jinzo, Zerato, Cyber Valley, you name it. And then I can activate the return and bring it out immediately to the field. The ability to tutor out any monster in the deck that enables your combos is incredibly powerful. And I don't think it's an overall game-breaking effect like Crush Card Virus, and I think that high skill gap with how to use it appropriately is one of the reasons why, if you go back to play this format, although it was a prize card, I actually think it's a totally fine inclusion. I think it actually adds to the format as opposed to what Gold Sark might do if it was on the power level of Crush Card. Next, for the Strap lineup, we have 3 Return from the Different Dimension. This was another interesting element of the format. At the beginning of the format, people only ran 1, maybe 2. They were running Escape from the Dark Dimension, the card that brought back a banished Dark Monster permanently. It became very clear by the middle of this shortened format that Return was infinitely better. The ability to bring back multiple monsters with Cyber Valley was just absolutely game-breaking. It turned these into pseudo Pot of Greeds. It allowed you to combo off and win out of nowhere. So the 3 inclusions, I think, was really important. I think if you go back to the beginning of the format, some of those decks are really unrefined, like the ones that Shonen Jump Coasted Mesa, for example. Once people really started to max out on Return from the Different Dimension, this deck reached its full potential. Then we have the only defensive trap card that Jerry ran. I think Torrential Tribute is the most effective if you want to run any defense whatsoever. Obviously, you can activate it in response to defusion. Theoretically, return, though, one of the best ways of using return is to activate something and then chain return. That way it resolves as chain link 2 and then your opponent can't torrential. If you don't actually have Jinzo banished, that's a really good way of playing around torrential. So what I mean, you can go, for example, Rhoda chain link 1, chain return from the different dimension, chain link 2. The only caution that I have there is if you do that, you won't get to activate Dark Magician of Chaos or Stratos. They will miss their timing because the return resolves as chain link 2, but definitely something to note. One of the best ways of playing around a common trap card at the time. And then one of the most important elements of the whole format, in my opinion, the 3 power trap cards. Unfortunately, Crush Card was a prize card for the beginning of this format. It was eventually reprinted during this format. So if you're going to go back and play this format, you could choose to include it. It did have mass accessibility by the middle stages of this short format. It was really expensive. It was like adding a 4th $300 card that you needed along with the 3 Dark Arms, but it was reprinted. Like Costa Mesa, it wasn't, though, probably the most important Shonen Jump with this particular deck legal. But nevertheless, we have 1 Crush, 1 Trap Dust Shoot, and 1 Mind Crush. One of the things that I have begun to do in playing this format years after it expired, years after it occurred, is I have reevaluated the importance of the draw engine. To me, the first turn of the game, particularly if you go first, is to use as much of your draw power as possible to draw into one of those 3 trap cards. When I was younger, or I think honestly when many players played this format, they would do things like summon Stratos, search their Destiny Hero, de-draw the Destiny Hero, and be pretty happy with that. In my opinion, the normal summon of Stratos is a plan B on the first turn. I would much rather try to find a way to utilize Cyber Valley on the first turn because I think it pushes your game way more in a favorable direction. If you're using a normal summon on Stratos, it's generally speaking not as efficient as using the normal summon on Cyber Valley and trying to dig through your deck to get into these trap cards. You know, sometimes when you do that Stratos play, you're limiting the amount of cards that you can see on that opening turn. If you could play some of those draw cards and eventually draw into either Gold Sark with a return from the different dimension or defusion or machine duplication, you can end up being put into this much more favorable position. So one of the things that I've done differently than I did back in the day is if I opened, for example, this is probably the best encapsulation of this, Rhoda, Cyber Valley, and Destiny Draw. Well, the natural play here is to go Rhoda for Stratos, de-draw the Malicious that you search. That is, generally speaking, the more desirable play. But I like the possibility of either seeing return from the different dimension with this already on the board, or maybe even drawing into dupe, or drawing into something like Malicious Greffer, where I can get off my Cyber Valley. So I would actually go Reinforcements of the Army for the Disc Commander here, and de-draw the Disc Commander and just leave the Stratos in the deck. I actually think Stratos can slow you down from actually winning the game, which is the overall objective of any game. I think trying to get these Cyber Valley effects off is a little bit more important. So that's one of the interesting elements of this deck that, in retrospect, I don't think I ever really did when I was playing this deck when I was 16, 17 years old, but something that I do way more now that I've gone back and played it. In terms of the decks you could expect at the time, I have a very small pile. Theoretically, you could face 6 Samurais. They technically won the first event where this deck was legal, but this deck was not very good, in my opinion, and did not have a lot of success going forward. From that point on, there was technically a DDT deck at the time. That was pretty good. I liked it. I always like DDT decks. What's interesting about the DDT deck during this format relative to other formats, and this was actually the last time the DDT was ever a deck in its entirety, is most of the previous DDT decks really relied on defusion. This deck could easily win because it ran cards like Monster Reincarnation and actually used Dark Arm Dragon. If you play Monster Gate or Reasoning and hit Dark Arm, it goes to the graveyard, so it fuels your dark count. Same is true with Plasma. So if you play more Plasmas and Dark Arm Dragons than you'd had in previous versions of the deck, you can actually fuel a bunch of darks, eventually hit a monster, Monster Reincarnation back to Dark Arm, or maybe you have Dark Arm in your hand and just summon it then on the first turn. Theoretically, yes, defusion was obviously a win condition, a power card, a card that you wanted to draw. So a lot of the times you would just win by using Dark Arm Dragons and Reincarnations. And then, yeah, certainly in the games you got Dark Magician of Chaos or Magical Stone Excavation or just naturally drew defusion, you could use it. But it wasn't as much of an emphasis. You didn't need to do it as much in this format as you could in previous. So that's the first deck that you could theoretically run into, rather the second deck you could theoretically run into, DDT. You could, of course, just run into the mirror match, so I'll put down 3 random cards from the deck to represent the mirror match. And then you have OTK decks. So by the very end of this shortened format, Shadow Priestess of Ohm was probably better than Toon Cannon Soldier, but there were variants of this deck that used both. The general idea of these decks was to use spell economics with Dimensional Fusion, with Dark Magician of Chaos and Cyber Valley to draw your entire deck, and then continually revive Dark Magician of Chaos or recur Dark Magician of Chaos with Defusion, tribute it off with Toon Cannon Soldier, and then continually play the Defusion. You end up not taking 2,000 life because of spell economics, and then you end up just defeating your opponent. Theoretically, on the first turn, if you were able to actually draw those cards. I'll show you what this looks like a little bit, just in case you're unfamiliar with this combo. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this OTK. It also theoretically was a combo that you could do to a lesser extent naturally in a Dark Arm Dragon return deck. So I'll talk a little bit about the context, and then we'll get into the actual FTK or OTK that you could theoretically play against. Technically, Jerry Wang actually played against a variant of this OTK in the finals of the event that he won, where he ran the deck that I'm currently profiling. So the FTK required either Mass Driver, Toon Cannon Soldier, or a card called Shadow Priestess of Ohm, which is basically a Toon Cannon Soldier or a Cannon Soldier that does 800 damage instead of 500. We have to tribute a Dark Monster exclusively. It can't be something else. Honestly, it doesn't matter which of these you have. The idea then is to bring together Cyber Valley, Defusion, Spell Economics, Dark Magician of Chaos, and oftentimes it also required you to theoretically have access to a machine duplication. So in this deck, you'd run multiple duplications. You'd run, obviously, the 3 Valley, potentially multiple Spell Economics, and then obviously the 1 Dark Magician of Chaos, and then a bunch of draw power. I'm talking about Upstart Goblins and Destiny Draws and Allures, Trade-ins, honestly, a bunch of draw power. And the idea was to eventually get to a point where you can go summon Cyber Valley, machine duplication, bring out 2 Cyber Valleys from your deck. This goes to the graveyard, which I'll represent as over here. So this is your current board. You have 3 Cyber Valleys. Now, in the normal Dark Arm Dragon return deck, you could banish the 2 Cyber Valleys to draw 2 random cards from the top of your deck. Depending on your graveyard, now if this is the absolute first thing that you did, oftentimes you just pass right now, but if you actually had a power spell in your graveyard, you could banish the Cyber Valley, banish a random card in your hand, and then put the power spell on top of your deck, which would sometimes be useful. What the FTK that we're currently profiling right now ultimately tried to do was to set it up so that it was able to activate Spell Economics and then activate Dimension Fusion. In doing so, the 2 Cyber Valleys would reach the board, but you wouldn't lose the 2,000 life because of Spell Economics. Then you could banish the Cyber Valley, a random card in your hand, and put the Defusion back on top of your deck. From that point, then, you could banish the 2 Valleys on the board, draw the Defusion again, and another random card. Notice how we've increased the random cards that we've drawn now by 2. From that point on, we could just simply keep going. Defusion could bring out all 3 of the Valleys. We could banish a Cyber Valley and a random card in our hand to put the Defusion back on top of the deck. Banish the 2 Valleys. We now get to draw the Defusion again and another random card. Notice I'm going 1 card each iteration, so you could theoretically draw your whole deck. Now, well, what do you do when you draw your whole deck? Well, eventually you, in doing this banishing of random cards from your hand, you actually are banishing real cards and not just face down cards. Eventually you're going to banish a Toon Cannon Soldier, and you don't even necessarily need to banish the Dark Magician of Chaos, but you could. And then what would end up happening is when you activate the Defusion, you bring back the Valleys, you also bring back a Cannon Soldier, and you can literally bring back any monster. I'm just going to bring back the Dark Magician of Chaos, but you could honestly bring back any monster. Theoretically, if you were to do it this way, this would revive the Defusion to your hand. But again, you don't actually need this to pull the combo off because the Valleys with the Spell Economics is in and of itself a recursion of Defusion because you can use the first one to put this back on top of your deck. From here, though, the Toon Cannon Soldier would shoot this off for 500 damage, or the Shadow Priestess of Ohm would do it for 800, or the Mass Driver would do it for 500. It really depends on what tribute version you want to run. And from that point, you would eventually win because every time you activate Spell Economics, you're no longer taking damage. And it could get to a point where here, honestly, let's say you drew your whole deck. Defusion, Special Summon, Defusion returns to hand using Dark Magician of Chaos effect. Toon Cannon Soldier shoots for 500, play Defusion, bring it back, return to hand, shoot for 500. You get the point. This combo has been around for a while in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, up until the emergency banning of Defusion. This particular deck was the only time it was really especially competitive because it comboed Cyber Valley and gave you a second way of pulling off this iteration that didn't actually rely on the Dark Magician of Chaos. Just these 4 cards was a infinite draw for your entire deck. So that was the interesting draw card combo that you could do. Now, in the actual Dark-Armed Dragon Return deck, the deck that I'm actually profiling, this was still an incredibly powerful combination because let's say you actually did have just one monster. Let's say you had just these 4 cards in your hand. You could activate the Machine Dupe on the Cyber Valley. So this is your hand. The 2 valleys come out. You could banish these 2 to draw 2 random cards. Let's say your graveyard actually just is Machine Dupe. I would still do this, where I'd go Cyber Valley banished, random monster in my hand, even one that has no value like this commander, to put this back on top. That way I could activate the Defusion and bring all of these back. These 2 then get to draw 2 new cards. And from this point, you've drawn 4 cards. If you drew just one combo piece here, you could extend. Now, theoretically, if you went back to this part and didn't draw those 2 cards, you could banish the Cyber Valley and a card in your hand to put the Defusion on top, and then banish these 2 and draw the Defusion again. Sometimes, though, you draw, let's say, a Dark Grepher with the Malicious, so sometimes you want to draw the 2 first. It can kind of depend on your perspective on that game, but the idea here is I'm drawing and paying 6,000 life points to draw, depending on the exact extent of your combo, anywhere from 4 to 6 new cards on that opening turn, if that is the combination of cards that I have. I don't care that I had to put duplication on top. I don't care that I banished a pretty poor card like this commander. All you need to do is banish something like Stratos, and then it's just an infinite amount of card advantage. In terms of the side deck, the very last thing that we always profile, thinking about some of the matchups at the time, again, we have DDT, we have 6 Samurai, we have a FTK deck, and then we also have a Dark Arm Mirror Match. Those are the decks that we have to worry about. To think about the types of ways that we can counteract these cards, there, that will represent our really 4 decks. FTKs, Mirror Match, DDT, and the 6 Samurai deck. I actually think the side decks at the time that people used were pretty bad. I've gone back and looked at a lot of them. Most of them were random one-ups. Some of them were a little bit more refined, but most of them had a lot of cards that I thought were inferior. To me, this is one of those formats where both players running the Dark Arm Mirror Match could basically just run the same deck game 1 and 2, and I don't think it's really that big of a deal. I don't think you're really putting in a lot of cards. Now, technically, people ran DD Crows for the Mirror Match. I think that's okay. Like, yeah, you can hit Disc Commander, but is it really that good? It's a crush target, I guess, but I think it's a little bit inferior. I would be putting these in so that in the matchup against the stupid OTK deck, you could banish the Defusion. If you DD Crow the Defusion, they can't win, realistically speaking. Like, technically, they could still find a way to win, as any deck could. They are going to draw their whole deck, but if you hit the Defusion, they can't do it in its entirety. They can play all their draw cards, maybe draw 20, 30 cards, but can they actually put together a win? Probably not. Defusion's at 1. If you banish the Defusion, they can't go through their entire deck for free, and they very likely can't actually win. That'd be the only reason I would side this. Same reason why I'd consider siding something like Spell Canceller and Cursed Seal and Anti-Spell Fragrance. If I went to an event back then, I didn't actually go to any Shonen Jumps, I only went to regionals, but if I went back to one of these events, my #1 objective would be not to lose to an FTK. Not much you can do about it game 1. But games 2 and 3, I'm going hardcore with absolute blowout cards. Cursed Seal, Anti-Spell, Spell Canceller, DD Crow, because you have all of the space in your extra, or your side deck rather, because all the other matchups you don't really side deck for. Like DDT, why side deck? I think your main deck is fine. Some of these you could put in. Dark Arm Dragon Return Mirror Match, I'm not siding for that. The last side deck spot could theoretically be allotted to some quantity of Kinetic Soldiers. 6 Samurais were a little bit annoying because of the original Shien, the one that allowed you to only activate 1 spell per turn. Obviously in this deck, there's a bunch of those. So that single copy of Shien was a little bit annoying. You could set your Kinetic Soldier, attack over it. You could do a variety of different things. Obviously, against an entirely warrior deck, Kinetic Soldier is pretty good. One last thing to talk about, because this is a Yu-Gi-Oh! History channel, I think it's important to put into context that this deck was a fairly short-lived deck because of emergency limitations and bans that occurred during the format. This in many ways opened the door for the Gladiator Beast variants that really did well by the end of the format. Now, technically, Paul Evedon won a Shonen Jump against this type of Dark Arm deck with all of these power cards with a Gladiator Beast deck before Geyseris was printed. But during the middle of this format, Geyseris was printed and all of these limitations occurred, making it so that Gladiator Beast became the dominant deck when Nationals rolled around in 2008. But these were the limitations. Defusion was outright banned, which is a pretty important moment in Yu-Gi-Oh's history because this banning finally put the nail in the coffin in the original DDT variants that had been popular for basically the previous year. You could run something similar with DDR, but it really didn't have that same punch without the Defusion. So that banning, huge, really hurt this deck, really hurt the Cyber Valley variant, really hurt any variant of DDT. Same is true with the Return from the Different Dimension. That Cyber Valley combo isn't as good with only one return in your deck, so that really, really severely crippled that engine. And then Allure of Darkness went from 3 to 2, kind of a weird limitation if you ask me, but nevertheless a limitation that occurred. As a result of these big limitations, I mean, you're only taking 4 cards out of your deck, but these are 4 incredibly powerful cards. The Defusions and Returns, in and of themselves, was the reason that you ran so many cards. It is the reason that you ran a card like Dark Lord Zerato. Dark Lord Zerato was not run in the aftermath of these limitations. A card like Gold Sark loses a ton of its playability when something like this happens. The entire DDT deck. Cyber Valley, I mean, it's an okay card, but when you're talking about not being able to recur it every single turn like you would be able to with something like Return, is it really that good? So a lot of the cards that were some of the most powerful cards in Dark Arm Return during the Dark Arm Return phase of the format ended up being cut as a result of these limitations. And technically there was a new type of Dark Arm deck, a little bit more of a controlling Dark Arm deck that was popular by the end of the format. We'll talk a little bit about what some people called Caesar Dab in a later video. But nevertheless, thank you for watching. This is a look at the very powerful Dark Arm Dragon Return deck from approximately March of 2008. Check back for more variations of Dark Arm Dragon Return and a bunch of other decks from Yu-Gi-Oh's history.